Something else that Coval offers is custom metrics. So there could be complex scenarios where, standard metrics, just plain old accuracy aren't useful. I mean, actually, that would be something. How do you, in a scenario where, this isn't like a math test, scoring a conversation isn't like a math test where there's a correct answer. You just get to some integer or some float and you're like, okay, that is the correct answer. Nice work, algorithm. When you have an agent handling a complex task, there's an effectively infinite amount of variability where there's an infinite number of ways that it could be right. Not even including the infinite number of ways that it could also be wrong. So what kinds of metrics do you use to evaluate whether an agent is performing correctly? And then maybe building on that, what kinds of custom metrics might your clients need?
I think you're exactly right that it's really hard to find the line between this is objectively a good conversation and this is objectively a failing conversation, but rather it's a spectrum. And so what we find works really well is layering metrics. So being able to run a whole suite of metrics and then looking at trends within those metrics. And this allows you to make trade-offs as well. So maybe you're a little bit worse at instruction following, but you get the cases that you care about most 100% correct. Because the distribution of how well you do on all these cases isn't like machine learning where you just care about getting 99% of examples right. Because if you're getting the one most oftenly used case wrong, it doesn't matter if you get the other 99% right, because when someone tries to book an appointment, they fail. And so we see that these patterns of what matters is correct is different than other traditional software applications or machine learning applications or even robotics. And the other piece of this is being able to show by having a variety of metrics, you can create a whole picture of how the system is behaving. So, for example, a short conversation isn't inherently bad, but a short conversation where the goal wasn't achieved and the steps that the agent was supposed to take were not executed, that's an objectively bad conversation. So you can filter down by whether potentially true failures or false positives or false failures, etc. You can basically figure out which ones are ones worth looking into through filtering by these metrics. So I think while we aim to provide all automated metrics for things like did it follow the workflow? Was the conversation successfully completed? Were all the right function calls called with the right arguments? There's also always going to be space, I think, for human review and really diving into those examples. And the question is, how can you use that time most effectively? So it's not that you never look at all of these examples, but you're looking at the most interesting examples.
Nice. Very cool. That's a great example of kind of what to prioritize. Are you able to give concrete examples of metrics? Like what are the most common metrics for evaluating performance?
Yeah, so we have a metric that allows you to determine if you're following a workflow. So for a given workflow described in JSON, which is pretty common in a lot of these different voice platforms, can you determine if you're following these steps outlined in that workflow and determine when you're not meeting those in the conversation? And this is super useful, I think, especially for objective oriented agents where they're trying to complete a task. Often, if they miss a step in that workflow, it's a really good indicator that the task wasn't completed correctly. So, for example, if you're booking an appointment, just to use a consistent example, if you're booking an appointment and it asks for the email and the day that they want to book the appointment for, but they forget to ask for the phone number, that task has been completed technically, but hasn't been completed correctly because it missed this key step in the workflow. Another interesting metric that we do, and then we also dynamically create these workflows in monitoring so that you can see what workflows your agents are actually going through in production and see how often, if that matches with your expectations or where you're seeing new use cases or new patterns of user behavior. We also have metrics around function calling. So, um, where the right arguments called for these different tool calls, and that's all custom configurable. And what's interesting here is I think we try to make all of our metrics reference free. So there's two types of metrics. There's reference based and reference free. Reference based is metrics where you have an expected output and you must curate that expected output with a golden data set and maintain that as your agent behavior changes. Reference free, we um, infer what the correct answer should be based on the context of the conversation. And I think for LLMs in general, reference free evaluation is really helpful because of the non deterministic nature, whereas like traditional unit testing in software is all reference based, right? Like it's easy to make some assertions about what an API call should look like. But even more so with voice and chat agents, the conversations can go so many different ways. And this changes when you change your prompt, when you change the models, when you change your infrastructure. So having reference free metrics, or at least a strong a strong subset and test sets that rely on those, is really important for being able to iterate really quickly. So we try to do function calling, create reference free evaluation for function calling. So we say, for example, if we're taking an order, can we confirm that the right function call was made based on what was described in the order from the user? It should match. Those two things should match based on a prompt and a set of heuristics. So this gives you the users a lot more flexibility. Um, so those are like just two examples. We've been building out a lot of metrics for new use cases, and kind of pulling them from all over the map of using off the shelf models, drawing from inspiration in self-driving of like, can we measure, for example, the agent performance um, against the human performance? Like if it took the agent longer to perform a task or shorter to perform a task, that's interesting intel. It's not necessarily good or bad when it stands alone, but if the agent takes significantly longer to perform a task and then ultimately doesn't or is repeating itself a lot, it's a good indication that your agent is going in circles.